Okay, everybody, welcome to this presentation, Mastering Compliance, Navigating GFSI Food Fraud Requirements with the Food Fraud Scorecard. I'm Mike Richmond, I'm your host for today's event. Before we get started, a quick bit of housekeeping for all of you. If you're watching the session live, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of our panelists. You can do that at any time, but we're gonna get to the questions at the end of the session. So ask your questions, I'll respond to you and then ask them of our panelists at the end of the event. If you're watching this on demand, you can also ask questions. Just email us at info@exemplarglobal.org, and then I will forward your questions on to our speakers. And speaking of our speakers, we have three excellent ones for you here today. Claire Winkle is the Technical Solutions Manager for Integrity Compliance Solutions. Jose Sabal is a Business and Risk Consultant from Sabal Food Safety Consulting. And Danny Nealon is Director at Food Safety Solutions. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Claire, who's going to get us started. Claire, take it away.
Good morning and afternoon and evening, wherever you are in the world. Today we're going to talk about food fraud, risk assessment, and how to do it, and how our food fraud scorecard tool. So I'm based here in Brisbane, Australia. We've got Jose, who's in Florida in the United States, and Danny, who's in Calgary in Canada. So I'm a GFSI auditor and trainer, and I've been working with food fraud risk assessment probably since most of the 2000s, but because I really got into it in a project in the EU, but I developed our methodology that we'll be using about 2016 and have used it on about 1,000 different ingredients and raw materials. Jose.
I have a question for you, Claire. Can you please explain what is this requirement for performing a vulnerability assessment and all of these GFSI requirements in BRC and SQF and FSSC regarding vulnerability? What is that?
Great question. And you're right, a lot of people still don't know the answer. Is there any differences about how the GFSI standards have their requirements? There are slight differences in the documentation you have to provide, but all of the standards require you to have some type of risk assessment to identify the vulnerability to food fraud from your raw materials and in some cases finished products. So that's what I'll talk about now. What is food fraud? It's economically motivated adulteration, but it's not always adulteration. That's the thing. But it's about making money. And that's the difference with food defense, which is not about making money. That's ideologically motivated. So it could be bioterrorism, sabotage, whereas HACCP, that most of us are familiar with, is unintentional accidental adulteration, which is all about the science and the foodborne illness. Whereas there's often no food safety risk with frauded food. The other thing that makes it different is different countries have different legal definitions of food fraud, and everybody should be aware of that, particularly when you're sending products to another country. So it could be perfectly legal in your country and illegal in another country. So FSMA, Food Safety Modernisation Act, hazards may be intentionally introduced for purposes of economic gain. So the focus there is on hazards. Canada, food fraud may occur when the food is misrepresentative. It can pose serious health effects, for example, unidentified allergens, or if hazardous material added to the food products. But it can also have an impact on the buyer because they're paying for product that doesn't necessarily have the attributes that they think it has. The UK has a much wider, quite detailed definition, and the Australians are quite simple, gaining a financial advantage or causing a financial disadvantage through deception or dishonesty. So that will have a focus for different people. Now, this is a list from the European Union from 2013 of the most frauded products. Now, even though it's from more than 10 years ago, the list is practically the same. Olive oil is still number one. Seafood and organic food swap around at the top 5. Milk, which might be surprising to us, that's not usually a frauded item in the Western world, but it still is very much a frauded item in the subcontinent like India and Pakistan and so forth. Grains, we've got numerous examples of those. Honey and maple syrup are quite famous. Coffee, tea, spices, and that's a whole range of spices, not just the expensive ones like saffron. And wine and even fruit juice are up there in the top 10. So how does the food fraud scorecard help us? Danny, have you got a
Yeah,
question?
Claire, one of the things that I find when I'm working with companies is that they often will struggle to find credible information on the types of events that could be a threat when it comes to food fraud. Both the SQF and BRC standard require that companies detail how they're going to gather this information and that they stay up to date on developing situations or potential threats. Can you tell us about how the food fraud scorecard has tools? Does it have anything that can help?
It does indeed. We've embedded websites that we know can help next to specific questions. So you might have questions about historical trends in that raw material. We've embedded websites about where do you get information on pricing. We've got websites for that. So, but we've also got embedded AI tools to help. But you will have to do your own homework. There are a lot of questions, very detailed questions in the food fraud scorecard that you need to know the answers before you start, particularly about your own supply chain. So you can go check your food safety certificates that you've got, double check those back to the public access databases such as BRC, SQF, or FSSC 22000 have. Maybe not every GFSI standard has public access databases, but these three definitely do. You can check all the details on your supplier certificates, which I highly suggest you do. You could put a spreadsheet together like this one and collect the information, not just about your direct supplier, but your supply chain, the manufacturer, the country of origin. Do you have product specifications? Do you have lab results? And even by doing this task, and see in this case, the ones in yellow, we don't have that information. So already I'm thinking cinnamon and desiccated coconut are probably going to have some problems because we can't access the information. And our brokers who we're buying off only have HACCP certification that doesn't include food fraud assessment. The other thing is doing a food fraud assessment is different to HACCP. So you have to collect different information. So you'll have to know about the likelihood, so the historical trends within that supply chain, that country of origin, that raw material. Detectability information, though, will be found within your own business, and we'll talk about that later on. And then I mentioned about pricing. You absolutely need to know about that because one of the attributes that you'll be looking at in the risk assessment is profitability. It's economic driven food fraud. You have to be able to think, how much profit margin is a fraudster going to make? And there are a lot of websites now that can help you with that information. There's recall notices. Anyone can sign up for recall notices from all around the world. This is a recall notice from the European Union, and you can see that they use adulteration and fraud as a category for a recall. And in this case, it's species substitution, that the frozen tiger prawns have been substituted with a different prawn that's probably I think they put in a farmed prawn that wasn't a tiger prawn, so cheaper product. Here's some of the recall notices from around the world. There's also the border rejection notices. So we've got one here for the EU. The FDA publishes those in the US. FICA is the Australian one. They call it the failing foods list. So it doesn't get to a recall. It's already been stopped at the border by various government authorities. Now, there are people who publish this information, and these wonderful monthly updates of the European Union fraud findings are published by a gentleman, I think, out of Belgium, but there is an organisation that publishes all of his updates and much more information that anyone can join for free. And that's a UK-based organisation called the Food Authenticity Network. So we've got the website there. Join for free, learn about new testing methodologies, monthly updates on fraud, different types of training available, and that. So this is launched in 2015. It's free. Everybody should join it. There are private databases like Horizon Scan's just one of them. You pay for a subscription and you get access to every recall and border rejection notice across the world. And you can see that you can search by suppliers, food fraud, and vulnerability issues and upcoming trending issues. So here we've got some from turmeric. We can see we've got a long history going back decades of fraud in that particular category. And sometimes I'll see a notice on Horizon Scan, and this is one from a couple of years ago about peanut contamination in soy lecithin. And I think, oh, we've seen that before from India in cumin and various other spices. I'll go back and look at what's happening with the soy crop in India. And lo and behold, the year before they had a major failure due to drought in the soy crop in India. Prices doubled. And so we know that there's a history of grinding up peanut shells which still have the allergen in them and putting them into other spices. And yes, the peanut shells are an exact color match to soy lecithin. So that's what I'd like everybody to be able to do. Look at these food safety notices and then go back and see why this could be happening, how this could be happening, and then realize that this is actually food fraud and it does have a food safety risk. So there's just a handful of some of the pricing, commodity pricing websites out there under different countries, different governments, different commodities. So, Danny, do you have a question? Oh, Jose?
Yes. So look at this, Claire. In any system, and of course, all of the GFSI systems are based on risk somehow. We need to somehow create a way to measure the risk.
Yeah.
Is there a way that with the food fraud scorecard, we get to that point where we determine what is a level of risk?
Yes, that's exactly what the tool does. It does a ranking, and I'll show you how that works. Now, with regard to what level is the particular risk, each individual company's food fraud team will have to decide on what their level of risk, acceptable risk. Just like in a HACCP risk assessment, there's no black and white line. But what I tend to find, once you've done the full ranking, all your raw material risk assessments, you'll identify maybe 1 or 2 or 3 raw materials that stand out way higher than the others. Those couple that are much higher than the others are the ones you need to concentrate your control measures on. So here's the general process of how to do a food fraud risk assessment. Looking at you're not just looking at severity and likelihood, because remembering not all food fraud has a food safety risk. Likelihood, detectability, and profitability. So these are different types of categories that the food fraud scorecard will actually ask you questions about, hence why you need to be prepared with having found that information. Now, this is a very basic how I do it manually. You end up with a score between 1 and 125, 1 being the lowest, 125 being the highest. Now, when I've applied this method, as I said, to 1,000 ingredients, the highest score I've had is 70. And I'm going to show you an example of one that ended up at a score of 60. And it didn't start as a score of 60. It ended up there because of information that we were given. So I'll just stop sharing. I'll show you some of what you get as the final outcome within your food fraud scorecard is a raw material report. Oh, I've got a report that I prepared earlier. Okay, so what I'll do is go straight into the food fraud scorecard. So here we are live into the scorecard. So I've done a number of reports. I now want to rank them to see which one's my highest and which one's my lowest. So what we're seeing here is that our Western Australian rock lobster ends up being the highest, and it's at 60. Just double check. I've got some. Okay. thought, yes. So you can see that my rock lobsters, when I first did them in 2023, they had a score 40. So then we reviewed them. And the reason we reviewed them is the company had had an actual case of food fraud brought to their notification. So we updated the information and we ended up with a higher score. And if we have a look here, we can look at the report that's created as a result of that. And this is the type of information that an auditor would want to see. What's your risk? So you get one of these for every raw material assessment you do. Clearly states the final score, likelihood score, detectability score, and profitability score. It gives the general information overall about this particular product and supply chain. It doesn't give the information about the suppliers. One thing we can see here is that we've got no manufacturer certificates because these rock lobsters haven't undergone any further manufacturing. They're whole, intact lobsters with no additional ingredients. So we can see, though, once we change the information that we've given over time, we change the score. And that's what people need to be aware of, keeping this up to date. And it's quite live information that's required. And so if we want to, we could go in and have a look and change the rock lobsters. So we might get further information and we want to create a new report. So by doing this, this will show you, so we've got the scores in there, we've got the answers to the questions we had, but now we can go in and change this. So what I might want to do is I might want to change it now to just Australian lobsters, because I've got more information about fraud that's happening generally to Australian rock lobsters. Now, I might add a new supplier. And so then I just click on here and I have it. Now, this is the information. So I'll have a new supplier name and I'll just call it. So I'm going to have to add my supplier information in about this new supplier that I put on. So I've got lots of questions I now have to answer. So this is why you want to have your information organized in a PRANS. So I'm saying, no, my new supplier hasn't got this. It's a name and address. Actually, I'd say don't know. I don't know. Now, that's the thing. If you say don't know, because you haven't got access to the information, your score is automatically going to go higher. So so you can go in at any time and make a change and update. And I might say, well, that's the only thing I've done. There's no other ingredients. So I'm going to save this now. And it might, even just making that one change might change my score, because I've said a lot of don't knows. So I'll have to go to the end to save it. So this will give you an idea. There are lots of questions.
Yes.
So, yeah. And they are all about likelihood, detectability, and then the profitability in different categories. So do you have lab reports? Do you have further documentation from the suppliers, maybe C of A's? What volume are you testing? What's the price? So the lobsters are pretty expensive. They're $100 a kilo. You can also put in your references. So this is really useful when you want to do your review next year or in 6 months' time, because you know what references people used before, whether that's published papers, websites, media articles, databases. And so then I'm going to submit. And then I can make a new report. So we mentioned about detectability. You can't just look this up on a database. These are the controls that your company already has in place. So some people are doing raw material assessment on all delivered raw materials. That's brilliant. People get lab tests, but what are they getting lab tests for? What type of certification do you ask your suppliers for? Do you hold retained samples, master samples that you can then test any suspect product against? Do you do testing like maybe pH, gluten, starch presence or absence? Because some of those are quite simple, cheap, and they can tell you if you've got an additional ingredient that you don't expect to have in there. Yep. So Danny, do you have a question for me?
Yeah, thanks, Claire, for walking us through that. Now, I'm coming at this from a BRCGS perspective. So the standard requires that companies put into place assurance or testing processes to mitigate risks when they get these raw materials that are high or a particular risk. Now, if I'm a company, then what kind of controls or mitigation strategies can I put into place? And if I'm an auditor, how will I know if these controls are effective?
Great questions, particularly for the auditors. Companies can come up with a lot of control measures, but how useful are they? So the auditors first up want to know, how did you get your score? What is your score? And what does that mean? So we've got some here, like the cane sugar, really low score. You don't even probably want to even bother with the extra control measures for those. Just concentrate to those ones like we had with the lobster. And there's some other ones I've got came up honey, Leah, like honey and so forth. Now, if you read all the food safety media, you'll probably be thinking, I have to spend heaps on really expensive, unusual lab tests. Now, some people absolutely do that. But you need to know what you're looking for. So if you know that something that, if you're doing dry ingredients and they know that one of the common things, it could be that somebody adds flour, like wheat flour, into spices, and then they might add some color to get the color back up in. So recently in the United States, there's been lots of issues with lead in cinnamon coming in from Central America. Now, for me, the lead's the symptom. Now, that's the food safety risk, but the lead has come from some paint, lead-based paint that they've added. I would say that there's something else they probably added to the cinnamon that meant that they had to change the color, which is why they put the lead-based paint in. So in that case, you could be testing for lead, which is what I think at the moment the United States authorities are expecting any cinnamon users to be doing, because that's the food safety risk. But there might be a cheaper test to do for a particular dye or color. So that's the thing when I mentioned about presence or absence of starch. That's a test that one of my ingredient clients uses because they can do it in-house really fast, really cheap. So what it tells them is something else has been added. It might be rice flour, it might be tapioca, it might be wheat flour, but they know something's added. Now, they aren't going to do a big court case. That all their owner has categorically said if they pick any issues up, they'll just return the product and say it doesn't meet specification and they won't use that supplier again. So it's not all about collecting evidence for international court cases, but of course people do. So this is exactly one of those cases that's been in the news literally this week. So this has come out of the UK. BBC, the TV channel, has done a big investigation following canned tomatoes in the UK that are labelled as being Italian, but they're actually from Western China. And they did undercover work and in two different ways. One was looking at the supply chain and literally doing the traceability, following those documents, and also satellite tracking. But it was also, they used trace element profiling. So we see that that's one of the testing there. And that's where a lab, and it's very specialist lab, will be looking to see with the mineral elements from the soil where the plant's growing. So in this case, it was an Australian laboratory that did that. And they tested 64 different tomato puree products. And 17 of those had elements that were consistent with Chinese origin, not Italian origin. So there's about only 3 labs in Australia that could do this testing, and one of them, Source Certain, works worldwide in this. So there are some people who want to do this type of testing, and it can give you absolute evidence. It can tell you then whether your salmon was free-range, wild, or whether it grew up in a cage. Similarly with free-range chickens. This company's worked with farmed barramundi, and they can now test the absolute origin of every farm in Australia for the barramundis to be able to tell whether it's Australian grown barramundi, wild barramundi, or imported. But not everybody has to do that. You can do trace checks, mass balances on your suppliers, mass balances on your customers, particularly if you've got outsourced processing. Always try and get actual lab reports, not certificates of analysis with no lab info. Definitely not certificates of letters of guarantee. They're literally worth nothing. When you're doing your testing, know what you're testing for and what you're going to do with that information in advance. So sometimes things like, as I said, pH changes, water activity changes, all of those can tell you that there's been a change in your supply chain, but you don't necessarily know where or when. Now, if you don't want to pay for the expensive trace element testing, you could do something simpler like HPLC, and they will tell you whether it matches a master known sample. And lots more labs could do that test than necessarily the trace element ones. So some industries, as an industry-wide, that know that they're being frauded, so this is Parmesan cheese from Italy in Europe, they know that they lose 2 billion euros a year to frauded products. They've been working on this for at least 20 years. They started with a visible cheese mark on the cheeses. They now, and this cheese mark is made of casein, so it's edible. They now have QR codes in it, alphanumeric codes, and it can be read with a smartphone. So that's industry-wide. And so I know in New Zealand, fruit and vegetable industry, they know they've frauded in Northeastern Asia, so they've put a lot of work in there. The wine industry all around the world know that they've been frauded in Northeast Asia, and they've put lots of technology built into labels, bottles, corks, caps. So there's a lot of technology happening, there's a lot of testing, but you can do really quite simple stuff. Jose, any more questions for me?
Okay. So look at this, Claire. According to GFSI benchmarking requirements, all of the standards, SQF and BRC and FSSC, require that somehow these elements that we have in place, in this case, the food fraud program, must be reviewed because things change and your suppliers change and the supplier of your suppliers are changing. So could you please explain a little bit how this review of the food fraud program works?
Yes, I can. And that is where the food fraud scorecard is brilliant. Yep. There's a lot of questions, takes time to set up first. But as you can see, to add a new supplier into my lobsters took me 1 minute. Now, there'd be further questions I might want to answer to make some changes. Maybe the pricing for my new supplier is cheaper. And it's that easy. I just click on that one, I recreate it, and then it will produce a new report for me. So I don't necessarily have to go in and fill in all the general background information about lobster fraud because it's already in there. I've done that research. And then the question is, what does the auditor want to know? They want to know how often you've reviewed it. What was the reason that made you review it? Oh, I got a new supplier. They were cheaper. Or I've just heard of a new incident that's told me that there's a different type of fraud happening that I hadn't been aware of. And so I'll go in and change some other questions. Then you get a new report. and you've got the date on the report. And as you can see, I've done a 2023 lobster report, a 2024 one, and I'll probably go in now and make some more changes because I've got new information. Now, what would trigger a review? It could be that your raw material inspection staff have found something that's different, looks different, smells different, feels different, different color. Or you might know that there's a shortage of a particular commodity worldwide, but your supplier hasn't put the price up. And you're like, how can they keep that price up when the worldwide price in the last 12 months has doubled? Or you've got a new supplier that's providing goods at a lower than market price. That is a real trigger point. And that's what we've seen. Certain countries in the last 5 years or so, like Turkey, have started supplying lots of food types that they don't grow. They're importing it in from other parts of the world. And the prices, in some cases, have been cheaper than the worldwide price. Or, as I said, a new issue has been identified in the supply chain. And that's exactly what we've had literally in the last few weeks, is there has been a new type of lobster counterfeit. So this came in a newsletter. So there's different ways that you'll get information. And so this is an Australian government newsletter that's telling us that there's been cases of New Zealand rock lobster being sold as Australian rock lobster. And they've got at least 2 documented cases in different parts of China. So that's something I hadn't thought of when I did my rock lobster, one that somebody would substitute with a different animal because they look different. But I guess if the consumer doesn't know what an Australian rock lobster looks like, they're not going to know that they're buying a New Zealand one.
Yeah.
So I've got new information. I need to go in and do my review, add another type of fraud that has occurred. So what that's going to tell me is I already know that the company I was working with had fraud done to them. We've now got 2 more examples. So that's 3 examples in 6 months, specifically on Australian rock lobsters. So the expected frequency of the fraud, that's one of the questions. So I'm going to have to go in and change it, which means my lobster score will get even higher. So now, one thing I will mention about the first fraud incident with our lobsters is packaging fraud. They received a customer complaint from a customer overseas who said, your lobsters really weren't up to quality. They sent a photo of the packaging and the lobster. It was the same lobster species from their same region, but the box had their artwork, but it was a different shape. It was square, not rectangular. So they know probably somebody in the same city that they work in had sent their 2nd or 3rd grade lobsters in packaging that looked exactly like theirs. So they've done a print run using someone else's artwork. So that's why I say it's not all about adulteration and substitution. It could be about faked labeling, faked packaging. And that's, as I said, the food fraud scorecard is brilliant. You can just go in and make the changes when you found a new incident or you got a new supplier, get a new risk assessment report. Keep it in your ranking. You can save it as a PDF, wherever you want to save it, and it's always there in the food fraud scorecard ready to go. And I just want to let everybody know that if you go in and register today, you'll get 10 free raw material assessments. So you can go in and start doing your raw material risk assessments today. So, do we have any more questions?
Well, Claire, we do have a number of questions from the audience. I don't know if
Excellent.
Jose or Danny have further questions, but certainly I can turn over to the questions from the folks that are watching, because there's some really good ones out there. I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit in order here. So this is an interesting question, and I thought about this too. What checks are there for say organic produce products, i.e. like blueberries having non-organic blueberries added to the weight of the product? That's just kind of an interesting question. What kind of a check or protection is there for that, something like that?
That is such a good one, and it is a quite common fraud. As we know, organic products are up there in the top 3 every year, and particularly the berry industry, our country, Canada, the United States, South America, we've all had berry fraud. What the easiest, simplest thing there, and the cheapest test you could do is just do a pesticide residue test. Because if it's non-organic, it's probably going to have some type of chemical sprayed at some point in its life. So there's lots, you could do your trace elements, but really the cheapest, easiest thing to test for organic products at all is just to do a pesticide residue group test. And that can be done by lots of different labs, and it's relatively cheap.
That's great. Thank you. Here's another one, and these are some fairly technical questions, so I answer this to whatever degree you feel comfortable. How different is the assessment for food safety, food defense, and food fraud? So I guess maybe a little bit of definitions for those 3. I know you kind of went through some of that, but talk a little bit about those 3 definitions and how they're assessed for those 3 conditions.
Great question, and they are different. As I said, they're different definitions. Under food safety hazards, you're looking at severity and likelihood. You need to know, is this going to kill someone? Is it going to make them sick, or a customer complaint? Whereas we know that food fraud, there's not always a food safety risk. So if you use the severity as one of your variables, you're actually going to distort your outcome, and you're going to miss those frauds that don't have a food safety risk. So that's where you really want to be looking at in likelihood for sure. Then you need to consider profitability. Because if you have a typhoon, a hurricane, a cyclone that wipes out, let's say, a large island in the Philippines, that's probably going to take out most of your coconut crop. Philippines is a major player in the coconut industry. So suddenly over 24 hours, the world could have lost a lot of their coconut plantations. So suddenly, from that one weather event, you're going to have a shortage, worldwide shortage of a crop. The price will probably double overnight, and that relates to profitability. So you really need to know about that. So weather events don't really factor into a food safety risk assessment. They're crucial for a food fraud risk assessment. And whereas food defense is not motivated by money, it might be motivated by external parties that have an issue with your type of industry, maybe the live animal industry with animal liberationists and so forth. So they aren't motivated by money. It's about their motivation. So some of these organisations then will have websites with their Lotus campaigns, which we have some in Australia. So the other one is detectability. Now, you could add detectability to a food safety risk assessment. I have it in food fraud and food defense, because that's about what is your company doing? What are the controls that you already have in place, either in your company or your supply chain? Because some supply chains, even in the spice industry, it's got thousands of years of history of fraud. Some supply chains are really proactive. Particularly McCormick's, they do publications. They're very open with all of the information. They'll give you a lab test back to the farm in southern India, and that gives you confidence. You get the names and addresses of everybody, all the parties along the way. You've got a transparent supply chain. That's going to lower your score, and that's actually something I say to people. They'll often start with a detectability score of 5. That really inflates their final score because it's a multiplication. So if they can even do a couple of activities to bring that detectability score even to 3, they're going to dramatically lower their final score. And so that's something I encourage everybody to do, to add a detectability score to risk assessments. Yeah, I hope that answered the question.
That sounds, yeah, I think it did. That's good answer. Before we move on, I do have several other questions in the queue, but before I move on to these questions, I want to remind you all, we still have about 15 or 20 minutes left. Just use the Q&A button if you do have questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can before we run out of time at the bottom of the hour here in about 20 minutes or so. So use the Q&A button if you'd like to ask a question yourself. Here's one that I had. What does PRN, I think she may mean RPN, risk priority number, stand for in the assessment process. So if I'm correct on that, and it's risk priority number, how do you calculate that RPN within this process?
Okay, the risk priority number is the final ranking number. And that's the score between 1 and 125. That is calculated as a multiplication of your likelihood score, your detectability score, and your profitability score. So you saw on the raw material assessment sheet, it had those 3 individual scores. They get multiplied, and that's the final score. So because it's a multiplication, if you can bring your detectability score down, your overall score will drop quite a lot.
Makes sense. Yeah, great. I think that was what she was getting at there in that question. So that's great. Thank you for that. And Danny and Jose, I mean, I encourage you guys to jump in with any of these answers as well. If you have some feedback too, don't let me step on you if you do have something you want to weigh in on. But this next one's a good one. I want to ask it of you. It's a little bit of pushback from one of our viewers, so I think we can handle that within the context of this webinar. This viewer asked, how am I supposed to be knowledgeable enough to complete some of these answers? I have no idea how profitable soybeans are to a supplier. I also don't have the time to research every ingredient and recall online. I feel like this is information that the suppliers should provide to me. They should defend their process from fraud rather than have me, a manufacturer, check each supplier. That's good feedback. What do you say to that?
Oh, look, it's a fair question. Jose, do you want to answer that?
Okay. So I fundamentally in the assessment, of course, that we may request a lot of information from our suppliers. That is expected. But we need to also keep in mind that anything that we receive from suppliers could be biased. And then instead of doing something good by receiving some information from them, we're actually performing an analysis on data that is, there is bias. There is a conflict of interest.
Yeah. And do you believe the data that your supplier gives you? That's my question. As I said, some supply chains are really open and transparent, and some are the exact opposite.
Excellent.
And won't provide the information. And it's a lot of homework. As I said, there are websites that can tell you. So if you need to know what is the worldwide price of soy, believe me, there's a website that's going to give you a 5-year trend graph on that one. It takes, for me to find the price of soy in India, took me about 1 minute on Google. I literally just put in, say, soy crop India 2021. And then I get websites telling me it failed, the price doubled, the response by the Indian government. Google is your friend. But there's a lot of databases and websites. Certain media outlets really focus in on food fraud, including
And there is something else, Claire, that we should take into consideration for this question, right? Anybody that has the responsibility to address the food fraud program, they are supposed to have enough time in order to do that assessment, because that assessment is assigned by each of the standards to whomever is the person responsible for that program in that company.
Yeah.
The thing is that, and this is something that we see day in, day out, is that the responsibility is assigned to say something, the SQL practitioner, the HACCP team leader, the HACCP coordinator, are so much that they require so much of their regular time that they lack of that necessary time that is
To do the
needed
work.
to do the work. Yes.
Danny, you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, it's sort of following along what Jose said, where it can't just be one person, it has to be a team approach. So push out the responsibility to the purchasers. Push it out to, as Claire said, your raw material receivers and your QA techs that are doing those sensory tests. Because if everybody knows what these common things to look for are, then you're going to catch it. And it shouldn't be just one person who's doing research on what's the price of my raw material versus, the worldwide cost. The purchasers will flag, hey, there seems to be a change in the pricing model, or, oh, hey, I got this new one. This seems fishy because I've had this food prod training, and they're going to bring it up. So it shouldn't be just one person. Push it out to your teams.
Yeah, and Danny's spot on. The procurement guys are actually following a lot of this stuff about pricing. They know if there's a tiny change in pricing. They know if there's a new supplier in the market that's got a different price. They absolutely need to be on your team, and they need to be trained. The guys on the dock, the guys at blending, they need to be trained to see if it looks different, smells different, feels different, stick your hand up. Some of the words that have been said to me is the cinnamon isn't cinnamony enough today. Well, yeah, okay, let's get on to this. The salt doesn't sparkle today. And that one took us a lot of lab tests, but we did find it. It's had products added. So I was at an ingredient site when the person who did the raw material assessment said the turmeric today is a different color and a different texture. I've never seen it this color and texture before. We ended up doing a whole lot of testing on it. Some of you might have seen me present, I think it was in Atlanta at the SQF conference, and we did a whole lot of testing. We did send it off to the lab, the specialist lab. We did test it against master samples. It was different. It ended up, why did the purchaser buy it? New supplier, cheaper. And that's when we sat down with the company owner. He said, yeah, we don't need to know trace elements. We're not doing a court case. We're just quietly sending it back. It doesn't meet our spec. Black band that supplier. So, yeah.
Yep. Excellent. Here's a question that I've gotten, I think, in every webinar I've done for the past year. So what role will AI play within food fraud?
Great. Now, I am not an IT expert, but we've already built some basic AI tools in, and that is the part we expect to change over the next 12 months as we develop this tool, potentially being directly linked into a number of international databases. Just even the AI tools to scour various media sources, various websites. I'm looking forward to that because I've got huge numbers of websites. If I had AI just searching them every day and then collating them and then linking them to my raw material list that I've got, and then sending me a thing saying, hey, the price of soy's changed. There's a now shortage of coconut, and we're flagging a trending issue out of recalls out of Finland. And so I wouldn't have to search it all because it would come to me and I'd focus in on those 4 ingredients that look like there's something happening with them. So I don't know if someone else knows more about AI than me.
Okay, so look at this. I do believe, like you mentioned, Claire, that if for some reason we may create an algorithm that is specialized in doing exactly what you described, we should be perfectly fine. For those of us, you and me and everybody hearing this conversation that rely on ChatGPT and Gemini and any of the other artificial intelligence that is out there, the concern is that the data, not everything, maybe in food fraud, maybe the data is, you can trust on the data, but the main concern is that the sources of the data that are being used by the algorithm is not from a scientific source, something that you can trust and something like that may give you information that is not the right. So that's
Absolutely.
the only thing that I'm going to alert people.
And during the development, because this tool's taken quite a long time to develop, the AI has changed phenomenally during our development period. And at the beginning, AI wasn't up to it, because we did try that exactly with ChatGPT and we were getting, well, rubbish. So I totally agree with you, and I talk to friends who are very deeply involved in AI, and I'd say it's what I describe and what I wish for. I understand that will be coming extremely soon from one of the major IT providers in the world. And that's what I'm hoping for, where we can add the sources that we want reviewed, that we know are reliable data sources, and that they can just do the summaries and the searching and tell me match it against my raw material list, that I need to worry about the 4 single items that are on my list.
Yeah. If you design the algorithm to look into specific places that you trust, that should work extremely good.
And hopefully we'll be able to do that when we do the second version of Food Fraud Scorecard. That's literally what we're hoping for, and possibly even then linking it directly into some of these large international databases. It's not there yet.
Great. Thank you, though. All right. So what do you do as a result of the score? So I guess the intent of that question is, what actions do you then take? You gather the information, you plug it into the scorecard, and then you get a result. What actions do you take, and how do you know what actions to take as a result of that score?
How do you know? Yeah, that's a great question. So I was talking about some of this. So first thing, you rank it and you identify those couple of ingredients you really need to work on. Sometimes, as I mentioned, one of my clients had a score of 70. It was for raw material that was a characterizing ingredient on their second most popular line of products. They could not do without it, but they didn't even know what continent it was coming from, let alone country of origin. So they knew that they had to work on that product because it was their most vulnerable. So they then basically started searching for an alternative supplier. Now, for this ingredient, that wasn't easy. So for some cases, one of my clients in New Zealand, and I think it was cinnamon, their supply chain just wouldn't give them any information, wouldn't even confirm the country of origin. And they knew the country of origin was incredibly important with this ingredient. So they ended up going to another supplier, charged a little bit more, but had complete transparency back to the source farm in another country. And so it was worth their while. It gave them peace of mind. It also then dropped their score dramatically, and they had all the data they needed to show any auditor or any customer. So sometimes changing your supply is your easiest thing. Other times, as I said, you could introduce some really basic testing, pH, gluten, starch, water activity. So one of my clients, their product claims is allergen-free. So they do a huge amount of allergen testing anyway because of their product claims. They then realize after going through this assessment process that actually by doing the allergen testing, they're going to pick up almost any substitution that would occur for the most likely products that they know would be substituted. So yeah, micro testing for things like salmonella or listeria is not going to help you with food fraud, but basic chemistry testing can. But raw material assessment, like I said, what does it look like, smell like, feel like? Hugely important. Danny and Jose, what have you seen out there with your customer base? What have they done for mitigate food fraud risks?
Danny, go first, please.
Sure. I do see a lot of the investigating of the supply chain, and I do see a lot of switching of suppliers to a local supplier, where there's just less links in that chain, and less places that substitution could potentially happen. And then testing as well. But even things like traceability exercises, as you mentioned,
Yes.
Claire, you know, that can be something that would identify an issue, right? It might not tell you everything, but if you find that your traceability exercises aren't lining up, then that's going to flag something for you.
And of course, I fully agree with you, Danny, on that. And I'm going to add something more. Okay, I was very fortunate, and thank you very much, Claire, for giving me the opportunity to test the software. Because after doing that, I believe that I don't think that any of my clients are going to have something as detailed and as simple to use as the software. I have not seen anyone going to web pages looking for process and then making a comparison, trying to determine, oh my goodness, I'm receiving something cheaper than the average there. So most likely there is a problem here. I have not seen that.
Yep. And that's so important.
Yes.
And particularly with your buying team understands that. Because when we picked up the issue with turmeric, I said to the buyer, and he'd been through the training, I said, why'd you buy this stuff? And he said, oh, it was cheaper. No, mate, didn't we go through this?
Well, that's great. That's a great one. Well, you know, I appreciate all of you for joining us today. We're at the end of our time. I do have a couple more questions in the queue. Just can't get to them today, unfortunately. But if you've asked a question, we will answer your question. And of course, if you have a question, you're watching this on demand, just write us at info@exemplarglobal.org, and we'll get your question onto our presenters. So I want to thank again, Claire, Danny, and Jose for a really, really great stimulating conversation. A lot of people responded to me and said they really appreciate it. So thank you for doing that today or tonight for everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming.
And yes, if you're watching this again, either on demand or live, you can claim CPD for this session. So we'll send you information about how to do that. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you again, our presenters, for a great session. And we'll see you next time at the next Exemplar Global webinar.